with you, right? I'm in the mountains of Utah where it is snowing, which is a good thing for us because we're a ski industry state. So I'm going to show you some images on PowerPoint, but so let me share screen. And then I will make the PowerPoint available too for whatever your website resources are. I just heard this quote from Martin Luther King listening to Cory Booker the other night. And I start with this sentence, this declaration that equity is not the same as love, and your efforts now to express love, compassion, caring, generosity, grace with one another is what I want to focus on. It's what really attracts me to this reframing. So Martin Luther King said that I cannot legislate to change a man's heart, but we can legislate to restrain the heartless. And there is a critical difference between equity, which is an official policy, an official, it is determined and defined by the society. What does equity mean? Now, a lot of cultures throughout time could care less about equity. It was very purely class-based or caste-based, as the newer framing of this issue is. But if we're talking about love, then we're talking about a very different issue. And that's why I'm going to focus everything I'm saying here, not specifically on your leadership, but on what it is that creates quality relationships among people who are working together. And I want to start with this wonderful quote from one of my teachers, Pema Chodron, that compassion is a relationship between equals. I was blown away when I first heard this many, many years ago. If we're looking for compassion, we're looking for a quality of relationships of true caring. That can only be if we see one another as equals, not as someone worthy of my pity or someone who deserves mercy. No, the word means to suffer together or to experience life, which has a lot of suffering in it, together. And we have to understand that this is the human experience, and we are participating in that and trying to make it better for one another. And in this, we are really up against human biology. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. This is brand new information for me, just having listened to a wonderful neuroscientist, Robert Sapolsky. And I'll put one of his talks up as a resource for you also. So we have this very complex brain, and the largest part of it is the frontal cortex. And Robert Sapolsky defines that as doing harder things when it's the right thing to do. It's where we develop patience. It's where we develop forward thinking. It's where we do delayed gratification. It's where we move from being reactive to being responsive, from instead of compulsively acting as we've always done, we move into thoughtfulness, planning, developing the long view, perspectives, all the things we're tasked to do, either as educators or as leaders. We have to think forward and we have to make plans. But the reason I stated it as love transcends biology is because what happens when we are in fear, and I would say we are a culture in terrible fear now. When we're in fear, forget about doing the harder things that are right. Forget, we can't think forward. We can't think about the future. When we are in fear, um, when we're anxious, when we don't know what's going to happen, when we're dealing with the level of uncertainty we're dealing with now, we are not in the frontal cortex at all. We're back in the amygdala. We're back in the reptilian brain. And you would know a lot about this from whatever you've studied to prepare yourself as an educator. Give attention to neurobiology. And I had to think about, so why is that so? And it's so because of this wonderful word, transcending. How do we become fully human? Or what Grace Lee Boggs, one of our great activists who is located in Detroit, who died at age 100, how do we become human beings? And that means, how do we transcend our biology? And it is through awareness, through learning, through being conscious. And that's the whole purpose of my work in the world, so that we don't remain in an animalistic way. We don't remain slaves to our biology. But this takes some work. I want you to see me for a moment. So one of the things I've learned, you know how we always say we should bring food to meetings? And now so many people are gaining weight because we feel the need to just eat to satisfy ourselves. Well, it turns out that in many studies, if people are suffering from low blood sugar, they become more mean-spirited. There was one study that Robert Sapolsky quoted from Israeli parole officers, and they would behave more mercifully, more compassionately, more humanistically if they had just eaten a good meal. And if they hadn't, if they were suffering from low blood sugar, it was totally unconscious, but they would be more aggressive and more mean-spirited. So that just lit up my world, because we've always joked about feed people. When you bring people together, feed them. And I think this is great evidence that, yes, that's a very useful strategy, not only for the conviviality that food brings, but also because we behave better. We transcend our fearful biology and become more open and humanitarian. Now, of course, I'm speaking now from the past and from, I hope, a not too distant future when again we can gather. But the work with equity is the work with seeing each other with compassion as equals really requires transcending our automatic responses that are evolutionary, that are focused on survival. And that's why I'm going to focus so much on relationships. This is hard work. One of the things I also learned from Sapolsky's work is that the part of the brain that deals with disgust, something we don't like or we turn our nose up at, or it gives us a bad feeling. In all other animals, that's only related to food. But in humans, our moral disgust at one another is the same part of the brain that is triggered by smelly food or rotten food. And we feel moral disgust dependent on how we are conditioned, but that disgust is real. And there are many other examples in the research. And I say this all because the work on establishing equity seems so necessary, but actually it won't happen while we're just dealing at the biological response level. So one of the other multiple studies have shown that if you show people a series of photographs of faces, like every 10th of a second, another face flashes by, When a face of a different color flashes by, the amygdala immediately registers fear. We are biologically, evolutionary designed to fear the stranger. This is anthropologically certain. This is well established that we only behave well when we're in our own groups. Hard to hear, isn't it? But it is our biological determination. But he also found in one of his studies that if you flashed faces of people wearing a baseball cap for your team, it didn't matter if they were black, white, or brown. You instantly reacted negatively if it was from not your team. But that just reinforces for me what I've studied in anthropology, which is when we're together with our own clan or team, we behave very well. And when we're in the presence of the other, we behave very defensively and with fear. So this is why I say that our biology has to be transcended by conscious commitment. And the easiest way to develop compassion is through developing relationships. So here are a few things for us to ponder. How do humans get through this time or any time of difficulty? This is a slogan I've used for many, many years. And it's a tragic realization at this point that humans can only get through anything as long as we're together. People who have suffered greatly in war or because of poverty or because they're migrants, they do know the truth of this statement. We seem to think we can make it on our own. That's the American ethic, and it's incredibly destructive right now. But this is something to keep in mind when I'm asking us to focus on relationships. It's because of this truth that we can only get through hardship when we stay together. And the other, this sums up all of my work, is forming community, because whatever the problem, community is the answer. Only when we're together, only when we're working in common cause with real, true relationships that develop our compassionate sides, only then can we solve problems. We can never solve these alone. You know this. I know you know this. But what I want to keep emphasizing is how destructive our current environment is, that is far beyond conflict. It's even far beyond polarization. We are now living in parallel universes. And when you're living in a parallel universe, you can't get through to people. So the need to come together in much more robust and meaningful relationships is so important. We're not going to change attitudes. We're not going to change positions. The way we create change is to develop strong community and to work together. And those are two core principles here. It's only by working together that we can come together. We don't talk about it. We don't change our views through workshops. We only change, in my experience, we only change our understanding of one another, our interest and curiosity in one another. We only change that when we're doing work together. And then this is, for me, very provocative quote at this point. I've used this for decades from Brother David Steindl-Rast, whose great work has been on gratitude. I hope you're familiar with him. But he said that ethics is how we behave when we decide we belong together. So I want to talk about this for a moment, because for me, this is the key to it all. If we don't feel we belong together, if we don't have a commitment to exploring being together, working together, understanding that we're in this together. I mean, everyone was saying around the pandemic when it started, we're all in the same boat. And I don't know who said, put it in the right perspective, but she said, no, we're not all in the same boat. We're all in the same storm. Some of us have great boats, some of us have leaky boats, and some of us don't even know how to swim. So when we want to work together as community, we have to care about this. It has to be an essential part of our life. It has to be, we have to each be operating in the assumption that I cannot get through this without you. I cannot survive alone. We need each other. Without that impulse, without that motivation, without that realization that we actually need one another to get through this time, then there's no hope for change and there's no hope for ethical behavior. So going back to David Steindl-Rast, that ethics is how we behave when we decide we belong together. If we don't feel we're together, we get what we've had all these years. Rampant illegal activity, rampant destructive, everyone working on their own sense of what's right for them, everyone playing the game for their own advantage. Ethics, which is a decision of how we are going to behave together, is only available when we understand we are together. And so when you're working in your communities, when you're working in a school, when you're working in an educational system, this is really critical for you to understand and act upon. That the first work is for people to recognize we truly are all in this together. Because without that, you can legislate against the heartlessness, as Martin Luther King said, but you will not create ethics. You will not create a system where honesty is valued. And we've seen this now. We've seen the impact of being so polarized, everyone in their own universe, making up their own rules of conduct. It's been very tragic, but I have taken really so much counsel from this one quote, that you can't have ethical behavior if people do not feel they are in this together. So we come back to relationships as the key to everything. So maybe this book cover is familiar to you. I have to tell you a funny story about the title, Turning to One Another. This book came out in 2002. I wrote it before 9/11, but it became a very powerful presence about bringing us together through reasonable, patient, kind conversations on the things we most cared about. And this is true. There is no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about, because whatever the problem, community is the answer. We cannot do this alone. But this title, Turning to One Another, I was told this story from a public school several years ago, where the faculty had decided they were going to read this book for the semester. It was they always had books that brought them together, which is a great practice, by the way, book clubs. So they just handed the title to this principal to read, but being who he was, he didn't read it correctly. He looked at it and he said, well, the book that has been chosen for the faculty study this year is Turning on One Another. They said that was much more reflective of who he was and his leadership style of conflict. But we are turning to one another. So this is where I'm going to pause for a moment more and say, the reason now I'm going to give you some practical advice, practical strategies for focusing on the quality of your relationships. And I hope I've convinced you that without strong relationships, without really feeling connected to one another, that we will not get through this time. You will have already noticed, I think, in your own experience as leaders and teachers and educators, when you have dealt well, increasing uncertainty, when you've been able to change quickly, schools are open, no, schools are closed. You've had mainly a lot of school closures, as I understand it. How do we adapt to the needs of children? How do we respond on a dime, really, to the demands of this increasing and a volatile this increasing uncertain and volatile environment? If you have done that well, I would guarantee that it's because of the quality of your relationships. And if you have failed to do it, if responding to constant change has actually created a sense of conflict within your staff groups, or among your peers, please notice that that's because you weren't in this together. I mean, what happens in this continual uncertainty is we are pushed back. We are pushed back into survival mode. And survival mode is the worst of us. It brings out our barbaric, every person for themselves qualities. We know this historically, anthropologically, that even peaceful people turn on one another when they're endangered. And certainly the neuroscience, the biology of how our brains work indicates that as well. So please notice in your own experience what has been the capacity you've either gained or lost because of the quality of your relationships. And I'm going to give you some lenses, some questions to really look at this more deeply within your own experience, within your own organization or school or administrative offices or community. You can also use this in your family. This works at home as well. But let's start from you thinking about when things have gone well, what was the quality of relationships? And if you were in a system, or if you were part of an administrative group, or if you were very well connected to your teaching peers, I'm sure that stood you well, because people can get through anything as long as we're together. So now I want to get very practical and focused for you on what you can do to strengthen relationships. And first, notice how things have been. So here is a question to be asking. And it's the last thing we look at, actually, when we're looking for test results, when we're looking for how we measure up against other schools, when we're looking at how we've done on, standardized tests, which is very interesting what's happening with standardized testing, but that's for another conversation. What is the impact on relationships? This has always been very obvious to me when I was consulting, that you could see a policy came down or a decision was made and it tore people apart. It created distrust. It created demotivation, no matter what its intention was. And it's all because, in my experience, this is always true, whatever we decided or whatever policy was created, it took no notice whatsoever of the fabric of relationships. All that knitting together, that weaving together of relationships that people do spontaneously as they do their work because they want to do a good job with their work. So people always, in my experience, at the beginning at least, reach out to one another, want to have positive, fruitful relationships with one another, and then some policy or decision comes down that just pretends there's no network of relationships, and also it's not important. And increasingly, as you make decisions in this constant turbulence, it's important to ask this question. Have somebody responsible asking this question. What just happened to our relationships? Did what just happen increase our trust, or did it decrease our trust? Did it drive people apart, or did it bring us together in a real concerted effort of feeling this is a crazy decision, we have to make it work, let's work on it together? But the sensitivity here is to notice what any action, policy, or decision or circumstance these days is doing to our ability to be in relationship with one another. And you would have seen this. I mean, we've experienced it with everything switching to Zoom. We've experienced it with terrible consequences on children who cannot be together in a classroom. We've experienced it in this whole culture where people no longer have informal or convivial opportunities to be together because of the pandemic. So somebody has to take responsibility for noticing and getting the feedback to you if you're the leader or you're the administrator. And if you're a teacher in a classroom, you just notice, again, I'm speaking past and hopefully future, what's happening to relationships among kids. So, and when we look at the current circumstance of what's happening to relationships, it's a very dark, dire picture, but it also then could lead to real creativity on your part of, okay, so how are we going to bring kids together even though they can't be together physically? And certainly there's been so many stories, and I'm sure you have your own stories of how you have approached that. But the key here is we are really focused on relationships because that's the ultimate strength. That's our resource for getting through any difficulty. So this is, I think, my favorite question right now because it's so diagnostic. This is a blue-footed booby that I nearly stepped on years ago in the Galapagos. He's actually a very graceful seagull, very graceful, but not in this photo. But what happens? How do you respond when something goes wrong? This, for me, is the most, um, it's the greatest diagnostic question of everything in our organizational life right now, because it shows our relationships, it shows our weaknesses, it shows our prejudices, it shows our um, trust levels, it reveals the whole underbody of relationships. So I would ask you this question to think about. How do you respond when something goes wrong? And you can think of the times when you've responded well, the times when you've responded badly. But all of our responses occur in this culture of blame, which is definitely the most destructive behavior and so hard to avoid. Something happens, somebody dropped the ball, somebody said the wrong thing in a meeting. And what do? Do we turn on them or do we turn toward them? Do we ask them why on earth they said that, or what's going on that prompted you to say such a negative thing? Or did you even realize that it was a negative thing? Or do we just blame them and say, there you go again. Yep, she's really dependable. She always says things that hurt people or harm people. So notice this in your own behavior. Notice this with your colleagues, notice this with your peers, notice, I'll tell you also another story of a banking leader that I was working with, and it's a medium-sized bank, and they had a security breach. And she and I have worked together for many years. She's the chair of my institute, the board chair of my institute. She is an extraordinary leader and has learned many lessons. But when they had this security breach and they didn't know how much of their data was compromised, what they wanted to say things to their whole community of people who bank with them, but they really didn't know the extent of the security breach. She and the president, she's second at the bank, decided that they would immediately put out a statement saying, we believe that no one single person is responsible for this. She wanted to remove the possibility of blame or single cause, right? Single culpability. And so she put out this statement, which meant a lot. I did an after action review with the staff, and that had been so liberating to them because they realized the senior people were not looking to blame anyone. They just wanted to find out as quickly as possible what went wrong here. But my friend who made the statement, she said to me, she said, even though I said, we just assumed that no single individual is responsible for this, she thought, what if that's not true? What if there really is one person to blame? But she proceeded with the statement, created an air of exploration. Let's get down to the bottom of this. And people felt relieved and freed to speak the truth and to come together because they were not, they knew they were safe from being blamed. And she later told everyone that she'd had this doubt of, oh my gosh, what if I'm wrong? And there really is just one person who who caused all of this. But you have to look at your own behavior here. It's so easy to deflect to another person and to blame them. It's so much more difficult, and it takes more time to actually be thoughtful, open, inclusive, and ask, so what are all the causes that contributed to this problem? Or speaking to the person you think or you know is responsible because they said something at a meeting that just created enormous problems. How do you speak to them? How do you encourage learning rather than blaming? How do you create openness rather than defensiveness? And in this culture where you will quickly be blamed by a board member or the public or a parent, it's very hard to maintain this no blame, let's learn from this position. But it's incumbent upon you to do this because it's the only way you can create healthy, strong relationships. And that's what we're aiming at here. So I want to speak now a little bit about learning. Sometimes it's shocking to me that I have to bring this up, but the question is more and more important because we're so frantic and we're so separate. What's the quality? How much time are you giving to thinking and reflecting and learning from experience as a staff group, as a peer group, as an administrative leadership group, or you yourself as a teacher or a leader? Are you spending any time on reflecting so that you can improve, you can learn? Now, you're working in allegedly a learning organization, an organization focused on learning, but is usually most school systems that I've worked in the past have not been focused on learning from experience. So My great teacher on how you learn from experience was when I was working in the U.S. Army at a very high level. I was working for the head of the U.S. Army, and I had observed a mock battle in California at Fort Irwin out in the desert. And I was just blown away by the after action review process, which is now deeply embedded not only throughout the military, but police forces, fire forces, emergency forces, because when something happens, they respond, but then they want to learn from it. And I've written about that in my book. There's a lot there about after action reviews, but my first experience with it was so overwhelming that I was talking to a colonel after watching this mock battle for many hours in the desert. And I said, this is the first learning organization I've ever been in. And he said, well, Meg, we figured that one out a long time ago. It's better to learn than be dead. I just leave that with you. So if you think that you are learning from experience, then where's the evidence? We're in such an evidence-based environment now. How do you know? How do you know that you're not just repeating your mistakes over and over again? How do you know that because of having this big eruption or this crisis, that you're not going to react in the same way again? I mean, learning is what we're about, folks, right? And learning indicates growth, increased awareness, increased capacity. You deal with life better. So take this to an organizational focus and ask yourselves, are we learning from experience? Are we getting more skilled? Are we getting more capable? Are we gaining the ability to process information that's relevant faster and as a team? Because that guarantees that we're getting better and better as we go through this constant learning period. So I'd like you to actually take this home. This is your homework. I've given you some questions, and you will have the PowerPoint available. And what have you noticed that needs further exploration? The quality of our relationships, what we do when something goes wrong, whether we're descending into a blame culture, whether we're learning from our experience. Those are the major themes I presented. So formulate, please, after today, when you have a little more time to think. Of course, you won't have more time to think when you go back to work, but it's the weekend, so let's assume you will have time to think. What's a conversation that would be important to begin, and just as important, with whom? And think small. Just think a few people that you want to start this conversation with. It will lead to very productive, good results. The last piece of what I want to speak about to you is your own ability to persevere. So I have a little book called Perseverance. You can go on my website and sign up for 14 weeks of getting for free, of getting page a week to keep us sane and keep us focused from this book, Perseverance. But this is the Chinese character for it. It also means patience. And it's a two-part character. The upper part is a heart, a knife, and the lower part is a human heart. So the Chinese expression of what it takes to persevere is there's always a knife over our heart. So we're always at risk. We're always at risk, especially in the social media environment. You just never know who's going to come after you in an egregious, terrible way. And the other reading that I have of this ideograph is that as we do the work of our heart, our hearts are cut open. But that's not a negative thing. That's a positive, because inside the human heart is our compassion and our love. So persevering as a leader these days is incredibly hard. And I have a dear friend who's one of the best community-based leaders in the world. And she's gone through, she was leading Neighborhood Centers, Inc., that then became Baker Ripley in Houston, 62 community centers, and several terrible hurricanes. One day, she was in a meeting with FEMA after some hurricane, and she was just completely frustrated because they were not responding to what people needed. And she sent this: every day, I have to decide not to give up. That became a really important sensitivity for me. I feel that. I would imagine that you feel it also. We are making a decision to stay at this point and to persevere and to keep contributing, even as things get more and more intense, even as the environment of conflict and accusation and blame and hatred increases. This has to be an active, conscious decision. I am willing to stay. And some of our greatest motivation is because we have this expression of love. This is one of my granddaughters when she was 15 months old, and she was actually saying goodbye to her dog, who was getting very, very ill. So I love showing that to you. It breaks my heart to see this photo. But Emmanuel Levinas said, faith is not a question of the existence or non-existence of God. It is believing that love without rewards is valuable. Levinas was a great philosophe, French and Lithuanian, coming out of World War II, wrote a lot about ethics. And this, for me, doesn't this define why you went into education? You knew that love without rewards is valuable. That's what we still have to rely on, this deep appreciation and our experience with working for others and not looking for the normal rewards, but understanding that these moments where we see a child bloom, or we see something really work, or we feel a strong sense of community, this is our ultimate reward. This is, for me, is a beautiful description of why we go into education. And as we do that work, I love this. This is true in my experience now. When the well-being of others is above your own, a different kind of strength, a strength that will carry you through life and beyond, will become available. Sadhguru is a great Indian mystic teacher. But you've discovered this already, haven't you? That when you are working for others, you find a quality of strength that lets you persevere, gives you enough stamina, enough courage, enough willingness, really willingness to stay in the middle of this turbulence. And that is a strength that endures, and it's quite reliable. And finally, one of the quotes that just feeds me constantly is this from Václav Havel, the great Czech leader, poet, playwright, and then president of the new Czech Republic, that hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well. It's the certainty that something is worth doing no matter how it turns out. In our educational environment, which is so objective, measurement oriented, although that is fraying now and being questioned a great deal, what is it that gives us the ability to continue to go wholeheartedly into our activities to meet the challenge of the day, to meet the crisis of the moment, to persevere with that knife constantly over our hearts. Well, it is this realization that I'm doing the right work no matter what. That hope is not the conviction that it will all turn out well. No, it's my own certainty that this work is mine. It's worth doing. I will continue to do it no matter what happens. But we as educators, I started out teaching in public school system, and I still feel I'm basically an educator. We as educators know enough about the human heart and the great human beings that are available. We have to draw on that certainty, that experience with what children are capable of, what we can offer to individuals and to each other as individuals in the same cause of teaching and learning. We need to draw on that now more than ever because we're not finding satisfaction in results. We are facing increasing uncertainty, increasingly difficult problems far beyond the virus. And humans can get through anything as long as we're together. But we are united as educators in a foundational faith in people and in the qualities of the human spirit. And that is what inspires all of my work now. And I hope that you will focus both on relationships and the power of community, because that is what brings forth the flowering of our human spirits. We can get through anything as long as we're together. Thank you very much.